Good afternoon for me. Good morning for most of you. My name is Herb and I'm an alcoholic, and it's really glad to be back on the call. Missed you guys. Please join me in the prayer for an open mind and an open heart, our commitment as expressed in this prayer. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. This call is being recorded. Please take a moment to just center yourself in the presence of whatever it is you're in the presence of in terms of your higher power. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Just as a reminder, the call is being recorded. My notes, at least, tell me that we've been looking at resentment inventory, making a list of resentments. Bill suggests people, institutions, and principles. My experience is it's been very productive for people and institutions, not so much with regard to principles, and at least that's just my experience. You may have a different one. But certainly if this is your first time or even your second time doing inventory through the big book, I would focus on people and then perhaps on institutions if you have a legitimate resentment. Let's take a look at the word. What does it mean? Well, literally, the word comes from the Latin sentire, S-E-N-T-I-R-E, which means to feel. And when you put an R-E in front of it, it just means again and again and again. I feel it, I feel it, I feel it deeply. Well, what am I feeling? Bill's term, resentment, is used in the context that it's anger. Your reaction of anger to circumstances or people or life in general, or maybe even yourself. Bill acknowledges that resentment for yourself is a legitimate resentment to be looked at in this work. We haven't looked at it specifically. I may have referenced the indication in the big book on page 66, but it says sometimes it was remorse, and then we were sore at ourselves. My interpretation is that that's a very legitimate resentment, and there are many people in my on-the-ground workshops that have this self-loathing, this judgmental negativity about themselves and their history. And I say, put yourself on the list if in fact you have a legitimate feeling, negative, anger about yourself. But normally when I'm talking certainly to a group of alcoholics, I'm saying, gosh, you've always made yourself first. So perhaps, how about putting that last on the list? We'll take a look at it once you get some skill at analyzing your resentments, at least in the way that I've been taught to analyze my resentments. Get some skill in doing it with people and institutions, third parties, objective in that sense, they're not you. before you begin to do a subjective analysis of your own anger for yourself. I think it's makes it a lot easier for yourself. So Bill has indicated that first column, and it's exemplified, modeled on page 65 of the big book. There's sort of a matrix there. On the left-hand side, you can see the names that are listed. There's, I think, 4 names. And then in the what I call the second column, it's not named the second column. In fact, let's be precise. I'll just take a look at it on page 65. It says the cause. So in the instructions, Bill says you make a list of the people, institutions, and principles, and then you ask yourself, why are you angry? That's the instruction on page 64. We listed whom we were angry. We asked ourselves why we were angry. Those are pretty easy and sometimes actually even kind of enjoyable or fun until we really realize the level of negativity that we have and the anger that we have and the energy that we're expending on it. And then there's maybe some sadness or some additional anger. And so we take a look at page 65 and we can see that this is not a therapeutic, cathartic approach to inventory. It's an analytical approach. What is the cause? Very succinct. This example is, I'm mad at Mr. Brown because of his attention to my wife. How succinct is that? Told my wife of my mistress. Here, very different and succinct, but still a piece of the anger as to why I'm angry at Mr. Brown. Brown may get my job at the office. 3 different, qualitatively different. And I'm encouraging you to use that as a model. My experience with this is there were some very deep, negative, expansive anger that's actually even rage, like with my father, that needed to have some catharsis, some therapeutic writing, stream of consciousness. And I recommend that if you have that kind of overwhelming feeling from betrayal or hurt or whatever the reason, literally, that you journal, meaning you write in stream of consciousness style. And what I mean by that is that you write from the heart and gut directly through the arm. Do not process it through the thinking filter of the mind. Allow it to just stream out in a vomit, a written sort of upchuck of your emotions onto paper, and don't be concerned about the lines and the syntax and the sentence structure and the spelling. No, because it's merely to allow Mount Vesuvius to overflow, unimpeded, unfiltered. That may be helpful to sort of get it out. But once you've done that, then take a look at it and try to be succinct in constructing your second column. I was angry with my father because he was an alcoholic, got drunk, and didn't bring the paycheck home. Therefore, we were poor on a regular basis. I was angry with my father because he beat my sister. I was angry with my father because he disrespected verbally and emotionally, regularly, my mother. I was angry with my father because he never showed up for any one of my sporting events. You hear the succinctness of it, and you can hear the variety of it. And it went on. I made a long list. In the early days, my very first journey through the steps, I was just asked to put it all down, whatever the feeling was. I've learned since in my own work and with work with my workshops, both on the ground and on the phone, that once you have 3 or 5 entries on the same person, it's going to be pretty sufficient. It's not necessary that you have more than one. If you have only one reason to be angry at somebody, you only have one. You don't need to have another. You have what you have. But if you have more than 3, let's just use that number arbitrarily. All right. Those are the 3 that we'll work with. Now, if you have, like I did, A through Z on my father, a lot of times fathers and mothers and partners and ex-partners have a long list. Make the list. Allow it to flow out. That's part of, I believe, the therapeutic treatment here is to name it, to acknowledge it. This did happen. We're not in fantasy. And even if we're in fantasy, this is our perception, and it's real for us, even though it's not real. Don't be concerned about that. If it comes to you, it's a gift of the prayer of set aside. Receive it, don't filter it. In terms of the first column and with regard to the second column. Once you've made a list of maybe 10 in your first column, maybe 20. If you don't have 5, then don't try to make it up. If you don't have 10, there's no reason to have 10. If you don't have 20, there's no reason to have 20. Have what you have. But if you have more than 20, allow it to be in the list, column 1 and column 2, and then once you finish column 1 and column 2, whatever it is that you have, whatever number that you have, it's your number. There's no indication in the big book as to the limit, the minimums or the maximums. You have what you have. Don't monitor it at this stage. Don't filter it at this stage. But don't exaggerate it either. Now, we're entering into the third column. I believe that you've had some opportunity to do column 1 and column 2. Some of you may have gone further and looked at the column 3 instructions and read my book in the chapter 4 on inventory and looked at my commentary and my experience, explanation of column 3 and maybe even column 4. That's fine. You may have listened to the recordings. I really encourage you to listen to the recordings on column 3 on the website. It's almost mandatory for you to listen to it and to re-listen to it after you've read the big book, after you've heard this discussion, perhaps even after you've read the chapter in my book, 12 Steps to Spiritual Awakening, if that's the choice that you're making. Listen to the recording, and maybe more than once. This is where you really need a step guide, a buddy. I could not do this on my own. I did not even know it existed the way I'm about to present it. The man who took me through the steps the first time in 1988 did not give me what I'm about to give to you. He just looked at page 65 and he saw a whole list of words that are in the 2 columns following what I've read up till now, and I'm going to read it now. These 2 paragraphs with regard to column 3, what I call column 3. It's entitled Affects My on page 65. It's not referred to as column 3, but clearly you can see there's column 1, column 2, column 3 by observation, not by nomenclature. And I'm just trying to be really clear because I'm a big book fundamentalist and literalist, and I don't want to confuse anybody. Or try not to. In most cases, now I'm reading from page 64. There are 2 paragraphs that give some instruction, some direction with regard to how to do column 3. In most cases, it was found that our self-esteem, it's one of the words in column 3. Our pocketbook, another word. Our ambitions, another word. Our personal relationships, another word. Including sex, another word. We're hurt or threatened, there's the verb. I had a reaction because I felt hurt or threatened. It was my reaction to circumstances or people that created the resentment. More about that later. So we were sore, a synonym for resentment. We were burned up, another synonym. Bill really wants us to get a sense of and a feel for what it is we're talking about here. We're not talking about momentary anger. That's a survival mechanism. At the biological, physiological level, fight, flight, freeze. Those are the three biological, physiological survival responses from our brainstem, the first of our three brains. That first development for biological survival: fight, anger, resentment. Flight, fear. Freeze, camouflage, hiding, secrets, dishonesty. Pretty cool insight, actually. I got it from Bill Wilson, who in the 12 and 12 in chapter 4 on inventory uses a very different model. 20 years after he gets sober, 15 years after he writes the big book, he writes the 12 and 12. He's been under the tutelage, the mentorship of a Jesuit priest, Father Ed Dowling, and he calls the origins of the problems that we're looking at in inventory instincts gone awry. That connects me to my understanding of biology, physiology, and even psychology. Fight, flight, and freeze. I hope that helps you. It certainly gave me a basis and an orientation with regard to really understanding there's nothing wrong with fight. It's just survival. There's nothing wrong with anger. There's nothing wrong with fear. It's about survival. There's nothing about hiding that's wrong inherently. It's about survival. But it's the way it boomerangs. It's the way we use it. It's the way we outgrow it, and yet we don't outgrow it. We continue these habits that we used originally for good purpose, and they've become a boomerang. Instincts gone awry. They're misused. And then he, very unlike Bill, becomes somewhat redundant. Bill was a careful wordsmith writer, thoughtful, conscious, never wanted to repeat himself, never wanted to use the same word in consecutive sentences. I've heard him interviewed on this. So it's pretty important when he, in fact, is somewhat redundant. Uses almost some of the words in this next paragraph that he used in the prior paragraph. For me, that's a signal that it's pretty important. He only does it a couple times, and I'll point it out when he does it in the big book. On our grudge list, another synonym for resentment. We set opposite each name. Column 2, column 1. Our injuries. Was it our self-esteem? That's a repetition. Our security, a new word. Our ambitions. He's already used that word. Our personal, used that word. Sex, relations, different combination, different implication, which had been interfered with. New verb. So we have three words now. We have a resentment, that is a reaction to something we perceive outside of us as a threat. It's a threat to our survival, at least in our perception. Hurt, threatened, or interfered with. And then he says, we're usually as definite as this example. We've looked at column 1 and column 2 already, but look at column 3. It is listed under affects my. He just uses those words that he used in those prior 2 paragraphs. Interestingly enough, next to self-esteem, he puts fear. Next to self-esteem, he puts fear. Next to self-esteem, he puts fear. There's 3 of them. Next to self-esteem, he puts fear. There's 4 of them. Next to self-esteem, he puts fear. There's 5 of them. And then right at the bottom, he says pride. That wasn't even in the 2 paragraphs. It's a brand new word. And next to security, the very last word, he puts fear. He changes it from the self-esteem pattern to connecting it to security. I'm observing. I have no idea why he did it that way and what he meant to communicate to us. What I do know is that there's no definitions for those words. None of those words in that column under affects my are there a definition. And he doesn't actually even tell us what to do with it. The man in 1988 said, match them up with columns 1 and 2. Kind of like a checkbox. I did that because I follow direction. Of course, since it was brainless, meaningless, it had no impact. I didn't have a definition and I didn't know why I was connecting them. I was just connecting them because I was told to. And it seemed like I could do that. And it had no meaning to me. This next time I went through the steps, the second full time with a step guide, 1991, this man gave me definitions and specific instructions. This is relevant now to the worksheet in the Way of Life document entitled Column 3, which I'm going to take a look at and give it kind of a scan. I'm assuming that you've already looked at it. Some of you have some experience with it. Some of you have made an effort to complete it because it's intended to be able to understand, because it has definitions and how to fill in the blanks. Some people have some success with it. Very few people are able to do it accurately the first time, especially without any help. I had to meet with this step guide in 1991 3 different times to go over the very same example. 3 different times. The first time I got it about half clear. The second time I got it about 75% clear. The third time I got it clear enough, probably 95% or better, that he said, okay, now go ahead and do it, meaning column 3. Analysis, it's an analysis. It's looking deeply, deeply underneath for our beliefs. I didn't know it at the time, but that's how it turned out to be. Penetrating the unconscious, actually. That's not hyperbole. I'm quite capable of hyperbole, but that is not hyperbole, meaning an exaggeration. My experience, and looking back over my shoulder, is that this work, this instrument of the 3rd column, allowed me to see my beliefs. So I use a metaphor that my beliefs are like my lenses. If I have blue lenses, you all are going to be blue. I won't know you're blue because I'm looking through blue lenses and everything's blue. My beliefs are the lenses through which I look. I don't see reality as reality is. I see reality as I am. It's a projection. More about that later on as we get more sophisticated in this approach and in this analysis and more experienced. This 3rd column instrument, this worksheet, allows me to take a look at through the lenses that I look through to see the lenses that I'm looking through. I can see, oh, my lenses are blue. No wonder my reality is blue. Or more practically, I'm looking through the lens of entitlement. No wonder I treat the world as if I'm entitled. I didn't know it, and I didn't know that I didn't know it. And I wondered why I suffered, because the world doesn't suffer people who are entitled. They retaliate in some aggressive or passive way. They suffer and I suffer because I don't see reality as reality is. I see it as I am, entitled, special, unique, exempt. And as long as I'm operating in this delusional world, I'm going to be very unsuccessful in my relationships with reality. You may have to listen to this more than once. It's pretty tightly worded and it's very dense. I hope it's communicating clearly because it was transformative. Absolutely transformative. The first time I went through the work, as I mentioned, I didn't get this instruction, and there's more to come. I got the 4th column instruction. We'll talk about that later. On the reverse side, later on in the Way of Life document, there is what's called a 4th column, which merely takes the last paragraph of the Rosetman inventory instructions on page 67 and makes a worksheet out of it with some other things that we'll talk about later that they're not relevant now. It would just confuse us. But I wanted to kind of like at least give the context that there's a 3rd column about my beliefs, and then the 4th column comes out of the big book with 5 questions and some additional things that help us sort out what our motives are. Column 3 is about my beliefs. Conscious or unconscious, doesn't make any difference. They're the lenses through which I look. Column 4 are my motives, coming from the Latin movere, what moves us. Again, penetrating the unconscious. I didn't know that I didn't know. That in fact, I'm totally self-centered. In fact, in my case, an extreme personality defect called narcissism. Irremediable, diagnosable. In step 6, you will see, if you want to look ahead a little bit at the whole definition of personality disorder. I put it in there to help people understand character defects, personality defects, defects of character. And I also put in the 9 characteristics of a narcissistic personality, not because everybody is, although I think that there is a taste of that in everybody, and that's maybe why Bill says on page 62 that the human condition, not just the addict's condition, is unmanageability, that spiritual malady, which is selfishness, self-centeredness, which is the root of the problem. Maybe. It works for me. It works for most of the people in the workshops that I've had exposure to over these last 23, 24 years. Maybe not diagnosable in the psychiatric DSM as a personality disorder, but certainly a flavor of the human condition. It's a survival thing, about my personal survival. There's nothing wrong with survival. In fact, it's our primary, primal instinct. But then there's a distortion based on either genetics or family of origin or life experiences that creates personality disorders of some magnitude, measurable and describable in the DSM. Just as an aside and a minor PS note, my own therapist said it's irreversible and not treatable by therapy or by medication. Yeah, 1990, I was having therapy dealing with my own personality problems, and the problems they created for other people. At the same time, I've done this work, so I'm very open to taking responsibility and knowing that there is a spiritual solution, and involved with the spiritual solution 10, 11, and 12. And I said, how bad am I? And he said, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, probably a 7.5. We put 10s in prison. Oh, thank you. 10 years later, Dr. Berger, who was my therapist at the time, and I became partners in doing workshops on emotional sobriety. I was no longer his client. And so I said, so what's your assessment today, 10 years later? He said, probably a 2.5. He said, and narcissism is irremediable, not treatable by therapy or medication, but it apparently is modifiable by a spiritual life, whatever it is that you've incorporated as your 12-step practice. He's in 12-step program also, so he understood and could speak the language. You never get over it, but because of my relationship with the spiritual life and the spirit has rounded off the edges. That's my image of the wind, spirit, spiros, breath of God coming in and rounding off the edges like sandpaper. I still have edges, as some of you know. And so it says we went back through our lives, nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. We take a look at the third column. This is what it looks like. I'm not sure that you can see that on the, but at the top it says column 3 and it has on the left-hand side, if you have it in front of you, it would be helpful for you, or later on. It has those 7 words that are in the column 3 in the big book, page 65. Self-esteem, pride, ambition, security, personal relations, sex relations, and pocketbook. Just as a clarification, although the word is sex here, this man said, I don't believe that it's about genital sex, because there's a whole inventory. The third piece of the step 4 inventory. The first piece is resentment. The second piece is fear. The third piece is about sex. He says, I don't believe Bill would be that redundant that this would refer to, so he gave me a definition as to gender. What is my belief about gender, male and female, father and son, husband and wife, relationships of male and female? What is my belief? More about that later. But you can see that on this worksheet, there is a definition for each of the words. Right next to the word. The words are in bold because they're in the big book. The other words are all interpretation. I call it the expanded third column. What is my deep belief about who I am? It's not who I think I am. It's not who I want to be. What is my belief? And it starts off with a prompter. Look at the prompter and follow the worksheet. Try to be as literal as possible with the worksheet. You probably will need help from a sponsor or step guide, assuming that they've actually been acquainted with this worksheet. This is not broadly used in the 12-step culture. It's been introduced by me and some other people who have had similar training as I have. And it's just so effective. That's why I continue to use it. I think it's in the spirit of big book fundamental literalist, because I'm pretty confident Bill would want us to know what the words mean and how to apply them. And that's what this does. A definition for each of the words and a prompter to invite us Pride is not the pride of the 7 capital sins. It's a very unique definition. How do I want other people to see me being treated by the person with whom I have the resentment? And so this man made it really simple. He said, use your imagination. Put yourself and the person with whom you have a resentment on a stage. Have an audience that's looking, a relevant audience. How do you want the audience to see this person treating you? So going back to self-esteem, what is my deep belief about who I am? What's my resentment? Let's just assume Bob. It's an example I've used from the beginning because it's so clear and it's from my history and it's pretty dramatic. Bob was a peer in my work and my career. He had the same amount of time. He was also a senior vice president, but he wanted me fired because of my shenanigans as I was drinking. I wasn't drinking for the last 4 years, but I had accumulated a history of wreckage, and he didn't see any change in me because, quite frankly, there was no change at this point. And I hated him for it. I have a resentment toward Bob because I'm a special gift to my employer. I'm the best employee and sales manager that there is. Notice on the right-hand side, there's a column for each one of the words now. We've expanded it beyond what the big book shows. The big book only connects to 2 of the 7 words. This man said, let's try it as an ability for a nuance of each word. My fear is I'm not as good as I think I am. First time I had that crack in my consciousness of doubt. It was the beginning of the curtain being pulled back so that I could see the truth rather than seeing the false mask, the persona, the Hollywood storefront that I had built, behind which I hid. Pride. How do I want the people in the audience, my coworkers, to see Bob treating me? I wanted them to see him treating me with respect. This man said, is that all you want, Herb, is respect? I said, well, wow, I would really like deference. When I walk into a room, he should stand, he should back up, he should bow. Now you're getting it. Exaggerate, step out of the box, step out of the ordinary, be ridiculous, stretch it to see if, in fact, what are the outer limits of your beliefs. That's a suggestion to you. Ambition, very straightforward. What do I want? I want to run the office. My fear is I won't get the job. Security, what do I need? I need to run the office. My fear is I won't, and I'll have a local boss to monitor my behavior, and I won't measure up. Personal relations, in a work environment, I expect people to respect me and honor me. If I walk into a room, I want them to stand, the men to bow, and the women to curtsy. This is the 21st century, and I apologize to you women out there, but this is who I was in 1988. I mean, literally, so demented. A product of my culture, but that's not an excuse. A product of my narcissism, but that's not an excuse. I was embarrassed. What is my fear? That I will be embarrassed publicly. Sex relations, not about sex, but about gender. Males in the workplace walk hand in hand, arm in arm to solve problems. What's my fear? That they're backstabbing, leg cutting, undermining SOBs like I am, because that's who I was at that time. I wanted to get what I wanted, and if you got hurt, that was collateral damage, and it was none of my business. The law of survival of the fittest. No, I embraced it. How about real women in the workplace? 1988. Second-class citizens, subordinate to men, there to do the tasks that we don't want to do, and other mischief, as you can well imagine. My fear is of being publicly embarrassed by women. Pocketbook. It's not necessarily about money, although this was about money. I was being considered to run the office, so there was some money involved, but it was also about power and prestige. If there's no money involved, what's the affected value? Nobody should get in the way of my getting what I want 100%. Nobody, no one, no one. What is my fear? Everyone's in my way. That's a shorthand, kind of description of the worksheet. I recommend that you do 3 that we'll explore, 3 different ones. One on one resentment, a resentment, on a second person or circumstance or institution, and the first resentment that you have on them, and then the third one, so that you don't get bogged down in any type of robotic thinking or habit feeling rut. If you have more than 20 resentments, limit your list to the top 20. Quite frankly, I'd be even selective down to 10. And in the 10, under each one, no more than 3, so that you might have 10 resentments, people and institutions, and under each you might have a maximum of 3. Because you'll be doing a worksheet, if in fact you follow direction, you'll be doing one worksheet on each resentment. Dad got drunk and didn't bring home the money. That's one resentment. Dad beat my sister. That's another resentment. Dad didn't come to any of my sporting events. That's a third resentment. They're qualitatively different, and there will be a different dynamic. But you'll see that once you do 1, 2, or 3, that you probably don't need to do anymore, because the dynamic is going to be there. The pattern is going to be there. So I'm helping you shape the work so that you can, in fact, manage it. Some people have 50 and 100 different institutions and people. I understand that. You do 10, maximum 20, your choice. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just making a suggestion. And you'll see that there's a pattern and a discovery that emerges that will become rather redundant. And why is that? Why do things become redundant after 2 or 3 or 4 analysis? Who's the central character of your resentments? Oh, I am. Yeah, how many variations on a theme can there be? Yeah, right, it's limited. It'll just be variations. The names and the places and the events will all change. But underneath, the motives and the beliefs will not change. There'll be some variations on a theme, but you'll see the patterns. And in knowing the patterns, then you can have an opportunity then to change. All right, so it's time. We do have to end now. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Let's close with the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, wisdom to know the difference. I'm so glad to be back. You guys were just great today. Thank you.